As we look again to the U.S. election, early voting remains the big story. 6 days to go until Election Day. And the latest figures, as we've been telling you today, at least 71 million Americans have now voted. That's a record that tops the total early vote in 2016, adds up to more than half of all the ballots cast in that last presidential election. There's a lot of talk about poll watchers, particularly from the incumbent, from President Donald Trump, making repeated unfounded claims about mail-in ballots and vote fraud. That, in fact, continues to be a key part of his final campaign message. Trump is urging his supporters to go to the polls, something that Democrats say is raising concerns about voter intimidation. A disputed result also remains a strong possibility. There will be, watching all of this, election observers in the United States, observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. They'll be at those polls, too, with the mission of ensuring the integrity of the vote. It's such an important part of the story, in particular with this election, that we want to tell you more about it. Ambassador Urszula Gacek is with us this morning. She's the head of the observation mission, and she is with me from Washington. Delighted to have you with us, Ambassador. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, and good morning from Washington, D.C.
I'm looking forward to helping our audience understand your role clearly. I think it always gives people pause to think of election observers, foreign election observers in the United States, because you think of the work you do in perhaps fledgling or fragile democracies. In the United States, this election, what specifically will you be observing and what will you be looking for?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that for us, this is very much business as usual. This is our 9th mission to the United States. We've been here for every election since 2002. And despite having Europe in our name, the United States and Canada, for that matter, are fully paid up members of this organization. So we are here at the invitation of the US authorities, not uninvited. And what we're observing is also pretty much what we're always observing. Your viewers might be interested to know, and may be surprised to know, that this is our 5th week already here in Washington and also out. We're covering 30 of the 50 states. And we're not going the day after the election. As is our standard policy, we will be also watching the post-election period and any complaints and appeals that are made in the courts. So what are we watching?
The work is already underway. Yes, what are you watching?
We're watching a wide variety of things. We're watching the whole campaign environment. We're watching the legal proceedings, all the rulings that are coming through the courts that are actually impacting the rules of the game in the 50 states, which each, to add to the complexity of this election, have their own election rules and regulations.
Can we talk? I'm sorry, Ambassador, I didn't mean to cut you off. I do want to spend some time looking at those issues that you raised in a little bit more detail, and I will. But I want to ask, although you said this is a mission that you have had with regularity in the United States, this is not a normal election period given the global pandemic. How has the pandemic affected the work that you're able to do?
Well, this pandemic has affected everybody. It's affected the candidates. We're following presidential, House and Senate races, so they've had to adjust their campaigns. It's affecting in a large measure the election administration. You rightly pointed out an unprecedented number of early in-person voting, but also a vast number of postal ballots coming in, which is putting additional pressure, for example, on post offices. So we're also, for example, visiting in the states. We're out there visiting postal depots, see how they're coping with the volume of mail and how they're sorting that. And then, of course, it affects us because we've had to scale down our mission somewhat, and we are not able to go everywhere where we would like to go because of quarantine and travel restrictions. But nevertheless, 30 states is a good cross-section: red, blue, battleground, big and small, north and south, east and west.
The early voting you referenced and the mail-in ballots, we were just talking this morning, more than 70 million early voters, tens of millions of ballots coming in the mail because of the pandemic, as you quite rightly point out. As you've already begun your work, have you noticed any problems or concerns so far?
We are always very cautious about drawing conclusions before we have gathered a significant body of material and facts. We're very much a facts-based organization. We have some 370 missions behind us, and we do get invited back and welcomed back because we're very thorough, but also very impartial. So at this stage, we are following. We try to get behind the headlines. It's quite easy to focus in on the long lines, maybe, or something that might make the headlines. But for us, it's to make a thorough assessment to see how the election administration is coping, and interestingly, how the voters are coping, because many people are voting by post for the first time. And this is quite a complex procedure. You can get it wrong. You have to have two envelopes. States vary in the requirements on signature verification. It's very, very complex. So in response to that, we're also seeing how is the voter education program going? Are voters being assisted in the right meaning of that word? And then we have to come and see how they actually, to the best of our ability with the team that we have here, how they will cope with counting and tabulating those results. On election day and immediately after.
So
yes.
It's premature to ask what you're observing. I'm gathering from what you're saying. You're in the fact gathering and observation phase. I raise that because it's the president himself who has raised questions about the ability of the Postal Service to function and the accuracy and integrity of this whole mail-in ballot system, with record numbers turning to that method of voting. And I'm wondering how much of an additional challenge or complication it poses when the incumbent, in this case the president, is the one who is raising doubts about the whole integrity of the electoral system. I have a little bit of tape, if we would listen to this together, Ambassador, of President Trump, again, as he has so many times, raising questions about the electoral process.
I am urging my people. I hope it's going to be a fair election. If it's a fair election, I am 100% on board. But if I see tens of thousands of ballots being manipulated, I can't go along with that.
The governor counts the ballots, and we're watching you, Governor, very closely in Philadelphia. We're watching you.
They say, we'd like to get the ballots and maybe get them within a few days of the election, and we'll take 10 days to count them up. Oh, good. Let's let the whole world wait while you count your ballots. And you know what happens while they're counting them? They're dumping more ballots in there.
So we have heard so often from President Trump about the election being rigged. He says so without evidence. He speaks to his supporters and urges them to watch very, very carefully at the polls. When it is coming from the president himself, what effect does that have on your work, and what concerns does it raise for you?
Well, I'm very cautious about commenting the statements of individual candidates because we are non-partisan. But we do listen to what all the candidates have to say, including on the other side, where there are fears that people might be excluded from the vote because of strict voter ID, for example. But what is definitely unique about this election is the fact that this is an election about an election. So the very way you cast your ballot.
Sorry, what you're hearing is just a video in the background of some campaign appearances with music as the candidates arrive on stage. I apologize, Ambassador, but that's what you're hearing there in the background. Please carry on.
I'll just show. But we also have, for example, the other side suggesting that maybe voter identification is going to be a problem. So we look at all of these issues as they come before us. But what is interesting is that for the first time I don't recall a situation like this in the United States, that the very way you cast your ballot has become a hot political subject. And also there's the subject of poll watchers, domestic poll watchers, which I'd also like to make a reference to, because in principle, we actually welcome both partisan and non-partisan domestic poll watchers. However, they must abide by the very strict code of conduct that we abide by, which is not interfering, not agitating, and definitely not intimidating voters or poll workers.
Well, it's interesting you raise that, because a court in Michigan just yesterday lifted the ban on people carrying firearms to polling stations. There was a ban on open carry close to a poll. And in Michigan, you're hearing from notably Republican supporters that they want to go to the polls with their guns because they are preparing, they say, for left-wing groups that may try to incite violence. you may have, again, as you said, some situations to contend with that you have not seen before. How do you approach even that situation of firearms at a poll?
Well, in that instance, also, wherever we will have our people, their security is going to be paramount for me. So they should not be finding themselves in a situation where they feel in any way at risk. Many states, in fact, 18 states, prohibit our presence in the polling place on election day by state law, and in which case we are likely to be in those states where we will be on the 3rd, in 15 states where we will be including, as well as DC, we will be staying well back, but maybe still able to observe anything untoward or not happening around the polling places. So unfortunately, we aren't able to field as large a field presence out on election day as we had hoped, because COVID has also impacted our own operations. We are being joined by additional forces, so to speak, from our partner organisation, from parliamentarians, from something called the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So they will help us as well. But what we will see on the 3rd, we will not be able to do a statistically significant sample as we had hoped, but I'm sure that we will have ample anecdotal evidence on which we will be able to report on the 4th of November at our press conference here in DC.
I was just about to ask, in all of this, I mean, you've raised, this is sort of an introductory conversation, I suppose. You've raised the key issues, whether it be what the courts do with ballots and decisions about when ballots are considered valid, to voter intimidation and suppression, indeed poll watching, all of the issues that we have been hearing in this lead up. Obviously, you're going to be following and hopefully answering concerns that Americans have expressed, because they too have lack of confidence in the whole electoral process, and they're expressing that at this time because of these very issues. So on November the 4th, what will you do if you find irregularities, and what consequences will there be?
Well, if we find irregularities, we give a fact-based, evidence-based assessment of the election, but our job doesn't finish on the 4th. We will actually continue following the post-election period, whatever the developments are here, whatever is going to go through the courts. And that, again, is not a departure from our normal procedure. We always stay in a country beyond election day. But we will not deliver our final conclusions together with a set of recommendations until early in 2021. One thing that we will not do, and we never do, is we will not be declaring on the validity of these elections. That is definitely the prerogative of the state, of the national courts. So if anybody expects us to say whether this election was legal or not, they won't hear it from us. That is not our job. It is to give, as I say, an impartial, well thought through assessment of what we have actually seen, getting behind the headlines, and also focusing on things that maybe don't make the headlines so often. So we have concerns, for example, how persons with disabilities will be affected by this election. Much of the new voting technology that is present in the polling places was actually developed to assist them, with them in mind initially. How are they going to cope with postal ballots? How can they ensure the secrecy of their vote in those circumstances? So nobody is forgotten, not the homeless, not the Native Americans with no fixed addresses. How are they coping with postal ballots? You can see the list really goes on and on. The most important thing is, I think, for the American voters, and we've seen polls that suggest that around 70% of them welcome the presence of international observers in this election, that maybe we can add a calming influence and restore some semblance of trust, which I think, we'll see. But this is an unusual time with COVID and a heated, polarized campaign. We are not here to add to the sensations. We're here to give, as I said, very measured, very impartial, non-partisan reporting and conclusions.
Well, that trust in a free and fair election has been shaken. Indeed, we will look forward to your findings, and I very much appreciate the time this morning. Thank you, Ambassador Gacek.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.